Aisha Thompson had spent the last decade navigating the shadows, slipping in and out of danger, playing a role in missions that most Americans would never hear about. She had been a ghost, a silent protector, a soldier in a war waged beyond the headlines. But now, at 32, she was ready for something she had almost forgotten how to have: a normal life. Her hometown was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with neatly trimmed lawns, friendly nods at the mailbox, and the occasional neighborhood barbecue. It was supposed to be the kind of place where you could finally exhale, let your guard down, and be just another person in the crowd. But Aisha quickly realized that blending in wasn't going to be easy. Aisha Thompson had spent the last decade navigating the shadows, slipping in and out of danger, playing a role in missions that most Americans would never hear about. She had been a ghost, a silent protector, a soldier in a war waged beyond the headlines. But now, at 32, she was ready for something she had almost forgotten how to have: a normal life. Her hometown was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with neatly trimmed lawns, friendly nods at the mailbox, and the occasional neighborhood barbecue. It was supposed to be the kind of place where you could finally exhale, let your guard down, and be just another person in the crowd. But Aisha quickly realized that blending in wasn't going to be easy. At first it was subtle: a lingering glance, a hushed conversation that stopped as she walked past. Then the friendliness felt measured. Some neighbors greeted her with warm smiles, while others seemed to keep their distance. She could see it in their eyes, the unspoken question: who is she really? Perhaps it was because she had been away for too long. Or perhaps it was because she was a black woman in a town that hadn't changed as much as she had hoped. In a world where familiarity breeds comfort, Aisha was an unknown variable, and people, whether they admitted it or not, often feared what they didn't understand. But what hurt the most was realizing that, after risking her life to protect her country, there were still places where she had to prove she belonged. She reminded herself that suspicion was nothing new to her. She had faced worse in the field: men with guns, double agents, and enemies who hid behind smiles. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy she could track or a mission she could complete. This was home, and home wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. So the question lingered in her mind: would she ever truly be seen for who she was, rather than what people assumed her to be? And maybe more importantly, how many of us have ever felt like outsiders in the very places we call home? Rick Donovan sat in his patrol car, watching the streetlights flicker as dusk settled over the neighborhood. The same houses, the same quiet roads, the same predictable routine he had been stuck in for years. At 45, he had long abandoned the idealism that had once driven him to join the force. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't making a difference. He was just another cop patrolling a town that barely noticed him, except when they needed something. And lately, even that respect had started to fade. The whispers about his past misconduct had never really left him, accusations that hadn't stuck, but had left a stain. He told himself they were exaggerated, misunderstandings blown out of proportion. Still, they lingered, eroding whatever pride he had left in the badge. Then he saw her. Aisha Thompson. She walked with the kind of confidence that made people take notice. Not arrogance, just presence. The way her shoulders squared, the steady rhythm of her steps, the quiet certainty in her gaze. But to Rick, that kind of confidence, coming from someone who looked like her, felt like a challenge. She didn't belong here. Or at least, that's what his instincts told him. He had never seen her before, and people like her didn't just move into places like this without reason. Maybe she was trouble. Maybe she was hiding something. Or maybe Rick was looking for a reason to assert control over something, anything, in a life that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. So he hit the lights. Aisha heard the siren before she saw the car. She stopped, turned slowly, her eyes unreadable. Years of training told her to stay calm, to assess, to anticipate the officer's next move. But a familiar heaviness settled in her chest. She knew this story. Rick stepped out, hand resting on his belt. "Evening, ma'am. Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Aisha kept her expression neutral. "I live here." Rick's jaw tensed. "That right?" He gave a slow nod, as if weighing whether to believe her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Aisha could see it in his eyes, the quiet war inside him. A man frustrated with his own life, looking for someone else to hold accountable. A man who had spent years making assumptions until assumptions became instinct. She had seen men like Rick before, but what Rick didn't know was that Aisha had spent her entire career reading people like him. And she could see the exhaustion behind the resentment, the disappointment behind the hostility. So the real question was, how much of Rick's anger was about her and how much was about himself? And for those watching, how often do we judge others not for who they are, but for what they remind us about ourselves? The flashing red and blue lights bathed the quiet street in an eerie glow. The hum of the idling patrol car filled the air, a low, constant reminder of the authority that sat behind the wheel. Rick Donovan rolled down his window, his fingers drumming impatiently against the door. "Hey, you," he called out. His voice was sharp, edged with something more than just suspicion. Aisha stopped, turning toward him with deliberate patience. She had been here before. Not in this exact place, not with this exact man, but she knew this moment. She could feel it in the way his words weren't just a question, but a test, a demand for submission. Rick stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt, shoulders squared. "What are you doing out here?" His tone was unmistakably condescending, the kind that dripped with assumption. He didn't ask if she needed help. He didn't ask if she was okay. He asked why she was here, as if her mere presence required an explanation. Aisha exhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. "I live here." Rick let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That so?" He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering just long enough to make his doubt clear. "Funny, haven't seen you around." Aisha met his gaze without flinching. "I moved in recently." Rick tilted his head, his expression shifting from doubt to something harder. "And you just decided to take a late-night stroll?" He smirked. "You have to understand, someone walking around like this, alone late at night, raises some questions." Aisha didn't blink. "Like what?" Rick took a step closer, the weight of his presence pressing down on the space between them. "Like whether you've got anything to do with the break-ins we've had lately." There it was. The accusation, wrapped in the thin disguise of concern. Aisha felt the heat rise in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Years of training had taught her control, discipline. This wasn't new. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where the wrong reaction could become a weapon used against her. She reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out her ID. "Here." Rick snatched it from her hand, studying it with unnecessary scrutiny. He wasn't looking for confirmation, he was looking for a reason. He clicked his tongue. "CIA, huh?" He glanced up at her, eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe that?" Aisha's jaw tightened just slightly. She had dealt with foreign agents, warlords, and arms dealers who had shown her more respect than this man in front of her, but respect wasn't what Rick was here for. She folded her arms. "You asked for my ID. You have it. Now am I free to go?" Rick let out a slow breath through his nose, weighing his options. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. He needed to regain control. His voice dropped, quieter but sharper. "You know, you fit the description of someone we've been looking for. Maybe I should bring you in for questioning." Aisha's muscles coiled, not in fear but in readiness. This was how it always happened, not with proof but with power, not with justice but with justification. The street was quiet. A few porch lights flickered in the distance, but no one stepped forward. No one interrupted. It was just her and a man determined to turn an ordinary night into something else. Rick Donovan's grip on her ID tightened before he finally shoved it back at her. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark with something that went beyond mere suspicion. "You got a bag on you?" he asked. Aisha's brow furrowed slightly. "Excuse me?" Rick gestured impatiently. "Your bag. I need to take a look." Aisha's fingers curled into her palm, but her voice remained level. "You don't have cause for a search." Rick's face darkened. His jaw tightened, as if he wasn't used to hearing that word, at least not from someone who wasn't afraid of him. "Excuse me?" His voice was lower now, edged with quiet warning. Aisha didn't flinch. "You heard me. You have no reason to search my bag." The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A porch light flickered, but no one intervened. Rick took a step closer, the weight of his authority pressing down like a loaded gun. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Aisha's pulse remained steady. "No, officer, I'm making it exactly as hard as it should be." Rick's eyes narrowed. "I don't need, because when someone's acting suspicious." Aisha exhaled slowly. This was the moment when an inconvenience became an injustice, when defiance became defiance against the wrong man. She squared her shoulders. No, Aisha had spent years training for moments like this. Except in those moments, the men grabbing her had been war criminals, cartel enforcers, foreign spies, and she had taken down every single one of them. She reacted instantly. A sharp twist of her wrist, a shift of her stance, fluid, effortless. Before Rick could register what was happening, his grip was broken, and he stumbled forward, thrown off balance. Aisha stepped back, creating distance, her body poised but controlled. She didn't go on the attack. She didn't need to. Rick's eyes flared with disbelief. He had expected compliance. Instead, he had been outmatched. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rick's face twisted into something darker, humiliated, enraged. He reached for his radio, his voice thick with anger. "Officer needs backup," he barked into the receiver. "Suspect is resisting arrest, attacked an officer." Aisha's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the cold understanding of what came next. She had spent years fighting enemies overseas, but tonight the real battle wasn't in some foreign country. It was here. It was home. And as the sound of distant sirens broke the night silence, she knew truth didn't always win. Power did. To those watching, how do we fight injustice when the very system meant to protect us is the one creating it? He turned to Rick. "What happened?" Rick squared his shoulders, his face still flushed with anger. "I stopped her for questioning. She got aggressive, resisted, took a swing at me." Reynolds' eyes flicked to Aisha. "That true?" Aisha met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "No. He tried to detain me without cause. When he grabbed me, I broke his grip. That's all." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. The older cop kept his expression unreadable. Reynolds exhaled, glancing between them. "Donovan, did she actually hit you?" Rick hesitated. "She resisted." "That's not what I asked." Silence. Aisha could see it. The flicker of doubt in the lieutenant's eyes, the weight of a decision that could either escalate or de-escalate the situation. Reynolds studied her, then made his call. "Stand down," he ordered. Rick's jaw clenched. "Lieutenant, I said stand down!" The tension in the air remained thick, but the officers took a step back. Aisha knew this wasn't over. She had won this battle, but the war against deeply ingrained biases, unchecked power, and a system that protected its own, was far from finished. She turned to Reynolds. "Am I free to go?" He nodded. "For now." As she walked away, she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching. To those watching, how many times must we prove our humanity before it is no longer questioned? Reynolds turned to Rick. "What happened?" Rick's jaw was tight. "Like I said, she..." Aisha calmly reached into her pocket, moving slowly, deliberately. "I'd like to formally identify myself." She pulled out her CIA credentials and held them out. The younger officer blinked, his posture shifting. Reynolds took the ID, studying it. His brow furrowed, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked up at Rick, something unreadable in his expression. "You didn't mention she was federal," Reynolds said, his voice even but carrying weight. Rick swallowed. "She didn't say—" "She didn't have to," Reynolds interrupted, his tone cooling. He turned back to Aisha. "You carrying?" Aisha shook her head. "Not tonight." Reynolds gave a slow nod, his mind working. Then his gaze flicked back to Rick, the cracks in his story widening under scrutiny. "So let me get this straight. You stopped her without cause, tried to search her belongings without a warrant, put hands on her, and then called for backup when she defended herself?" Rick's face went red. "She was resisting. She—" Reynolds held up a hand. "That's enough." A silence fell over the scene. Then Reynolds exhaled, his voice measured. "Rick, hand over your badge and gun." Rick's eyes went wide. "What?" "You're suspended pending an investigation." Reynolds' tone left no room for argument. "We'll sort this out at the station, but as of right now, you're done." Rick clenched his fists. His whole body was rigid, disbelief and fury warring in his expression. But he knew better than to push it further. With stiff movements, he unhooked his badge, yanking it from his chest, and slammed it into Reynolds' waiting hand. Aisha watched without satisfaction, only quiet understanding. This wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was a step. Reynolds turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Aisha met his gaze. "I will be." The officers dispersed, the tension still lingering in the air like a storm that had passed but left behind unsettled skies. As Aisha stood there watching Rick walk away, she couldn't help but wonder, how many times had this played out without a witness, without consequences? And more importantly, how many people never got the chance to tell their side of the story? Internal Affairs had already begun pulling files, listening to whispers from officers who had long suspected Rick wasn't the man he pretended to be. But it was the surveillance footage that sealed his fate. The neighborhood had cameras, hidden in doorbells, mounted under porch eaves, tucked away in places that people like Rick often forgot to consider. The footage showed everything. It showed Aisha walking calmly, minding her business. It showed Rick stopping her without cause, escalating the situation, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force. And it showed Aisha, calm, controlled, defending herself without aggression, without malice, just necessity. It was undeniable. Then came the testimonies. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds gave his statement, firm and unwavering. The responding officers, particularly the younger one who had sensed something was off from the beginning, confirmed the inconsistencies in Rick's account. Piece by piece, the version of events Rick had tried to construct crumbled beneath the weight of evidence. The reckoning. When Rick was called into Internal Affairs, he already knew what was coming. The room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above him. Across the table sat investigators, expressions unreadable, eyes sharp. "We've reviewed the footage, Donovan." Rick said nothing. "The complaint you filed against Agent Thompson, it's not holding up. In fact, it reads more like an attempt to cover your own misconduct." His fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "Given your history, along with the evidence from this case, the department has no choice but to move forward with disciplinary action." A pause. "Your badge is being revoked, effective immediately." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Rick's mouth was dry. "You're making a mistake." "No," the investigator said. "You did." Rick stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His jaw was clenched so tightly it ached, his breath heavy. He wanted to lash out, to fight back, but there was nothing left to fight with. For years, he had been untouchable. But now, the truth had done what no one else had been able to do. It had stripped him of his power. Reflection. As news of Rick's downfall spread, Aisha remained composed. She didn't celebrate. There was no victory in something that should have never happened in the first place. She had spent her life serving a country that sometimes failed people like her. But she had also learned that justice wasn't about moments. It was about movements, about people willing to stand up, to speak, to fight for something greater than themselves. And as she looked ahead, she knew one thing for certain: the system only changes when people refuse to be silent. To those watching, how often do we assume that power means righteousness? And how many times has truth been buried simply because no one was there to record it? The hum of an engine idled low in the night air, barely audible beneath the distant sounds of the city settling into darkness. Aisha knew he was there before she even pulled back the curtain. Rick Donovan, parked across the street in an unmarked car, just far enough to be subtle but close enough to be noticed. It had been 3 nights now. She could feel his presence like a weight pressing against the air, heavy with resentment, thick with the kind of anger that came from a man who had lost everything but his pride. Rick wasn't just watching, he was waiting. The confrontation. Aisha had spent her career confronting men who thought power made them untouchable. She had faced warlords, criminals, and spies who held their authority like a weapon, assuming fear would keep people in line. Rick Donovan was no different, and she refused to let him think he still had control. So that night, she walked out, deliberate, unshaken, each step firm, her breath even, her heart steady. Rick saw her coming, but he didn't move. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Aisha stopped just beside his car, leaning down slightly so their eyes met through the driver's side window. "You want to talk, Rick?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Or are you just here to make yourself feel like a man again?" Rick's jaw twitched, his fingers flexing against the wheel. "You think this is over?" His voice was low, laced with bitterness. Aisha exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "It is over. You lost, and you know it." Rick let out a humorless chuckle, but there was no amusement in his eyes, just something darker, something desperate. "Men like me don't just disappear," he muttered. Aisha held his gaze unwavering. "No," she said, "but you do self-destruct." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Recognition. The truth in her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. The confrontation. Aisha had spent her career confronting men who thought power made them untouchable. She had faced warlords, criminals, and spies who held their authority like a weapon, assuming fear would keep people in line. Rick Donovan was no different, and she refused to let him think he still had control. So that night she walked out, deliberate, unshaken, each step firm, her breath even, her heart steady. Rick saw her coming, but he didn't move. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Aisha stopped just beside his car, leaning down slightly so their eyes met through the driver's side window. "You want to talk, Rick?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Or are you just here to make yourself feel like a man again?" Rick's jaw twitched, his fingers flexing against the wheel. "You think this is over?" His voice was low, laced with bitterness. Aisha exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "It is over. You lost, and you know it." Rick let out a humorless chuckle, but there was no amusement in his eyes, just something darker, something desperate. "Men like me don't just disappear," he muttered. Aisha held his gaze unwavering. "No," she said, "but you do self-destruct." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Recognition. The truth in her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. Resolution and systemic issues. The hearing room was sterile. Grey walls, dim lighting, the faint scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't dramatic, no grand moment of justice. Just paperwork, testimony, and the quiet, crushing weight of consequence. Rick Donovan sat stiffly in his chair, his face drawn, his hands clasped together on the table as if he were holding himself together. Across from him, a panel of officials from Internal Affairs listened to the final review of his case. Pattern of misconduct, multiple complaints spanning years, documented abuse of power. The words blurred together in Rick's mind. He had heard them before. Warnings, suspensions, but always he had survived them. Not this time. We find that Officer Donovan's actions on the night in question, along with his established history of misconduct, demonstrate a clear violation of departmental policies and ethical standards, the lead investigator stated, his voice steady and final. Effective immediately, you are terminated from the force. Rick barely breathed. He wanted to fight back, to protest, but there was nothing left to say. He had been given power, and now it had been taken away. The truth comes to light. The Internal Affairs report was released publicly a week later. The headlines were brutal. Pattern of abuse. Officer's history of misconduct exposed after termination. Fired cop accused of racial profiling, unlawful searches, and excessive force. How did Rick Donovan stay on the force this long? For years his behavior had been whispered about, questioned behind closed doors, buried under bureaucratic red tape. But now, it was all in black and white. Complaints ignored, warnings unheeded, a system that had protected him until it no longer could. The city buzzed with conversations about police accountability. Some were outraged that it had taken this long. Others defended him, claiming he had just been doing his job. But no one could deny the facts. Rick Donovan was exactly the kind of man who should have never worn a badge. He had been given power, and now it had been taken away. The truth comes to light. The Internal Affairs report was released publicly a week later. The headlines were brutal. Pattern of abuse, officer's history of misconduct exposed after termination. Fired cop accused of racial profiling, unlawful searches, and excessive force. How did Rick Donovan stay on the force this long? For years his behavior had been whispered about, questioned behind closed doors, buried under bureaucratic red tape. But now it was all in black and white, complaints ignored, warnings unheeded, a system that had protected him until it no longer could. The city buzzed with conversations about police accountability. Some were outraged that it had taken this long. Others defended him, claiming he had just been doing his job. But no one could deny the facts. Rick Donovan was exactly the kind of man who should have never worn a badge. Reflection. Rick Donovan was gone, but he was never the real problem. The problem was the system that had allowed him to exist unchecked for so long. Aisha knew this wasn't the end. There would be more like him. More battles to fight. More truths to uncover. But for now she allowed herself one small moment of peace. Not because justice had been served, but because the conversation had begun. And that was how real change always started. To those watching, how many more stories like this have gone untold? And how do we ensure that power is held accountable before it's too late? The story of Aisha Thompson and Rick Donovan isn't just about one night or one bad officer. It's about something bigger, something woven into the very fabric of the system itself. It's about how racial bias, unchecked power, and institutional failures allow officers like Rick to exist, to thrive, to harm without consequence, until, finally, someone refuses to stay silent. For years, Rick operated without accountability, protected by bureaucracy, by silence, by the willingness of those around him to look the other way. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of a system that had allowed him to exist. And while Aisha may have won this battle, she knows that the fight for justice is far from over. Because for every Rick Donovan who gets caught, there are countless others still out there. For every Aisha who stands her ground, there are voices that go unheard. So the real question isn't just about what happened here. It's about what happens next. How do we break the cycle? How do we ensure that power is not just wielded but held accountable? Let's continue this conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, because awareness is only the first step. Real change begins with what we do next.